This is the Dallas Morning News.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, where we explore America's fascinating past with our country's leading historians and thought leaders. For this podcast, I interviewed Richard Carwardine, one of the leading biographers of Abraham Lincoln, about Richard's new book, Righteous Strife: How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. His book came out on January 21st, 2025, and we did the program in front of a live audience in Dallas on November the 11th, 2025. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so Richard, as I said, here you are, born in Wales, spent almost your entire life in Great Britain, and yet you've written all these books on Abraham Lincoln. He is the dominant subject of your life's work. So how did you happen to choose America's great to be such a focus of your study and writing and publications?
Talmage, that's a very good question. And let me begin by thanking you very much for inviting me and to all of you for coming. I didn't set out to become a Lincolnian. It happened by accident and by stages. I first encountered Lincoln, I think, on the back page of a comic that I read as an eight-year-old. My parents would not allow me to have ordinary comics, but they said I could they would get this weekly comic, which was an educational comic. And on the back page, in installments, there were the lives of great people, great men and women. And one of these, I recall, was Abraham Lincoln. Little did I know then that Lincoln would become the focus of my scholarship over the last quarter of a century. I didn't set out as an American historian to focus on the politics of the Civil War, let alone Lincoln himself. I did set out as a historian after Oxford, where I'd become particularly attracted to American history because, not least, it's in a tongue that I can understand. Mostly. I'm not a good linguist. My choice of finally a subject in Oxford was Slavery and Secession, set up by the great Civil War historian Alan Nevins back in the early 1950s. And it was a terrific subject. It was just absolutely freighted with the very best kind of documentation, including the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And that's when I first encountered Lincoln seriously. And that, of course, piqued my interest in American history. But I began as a graduate student working on American religion, and my first significant book on American history was one that I wrote, published in the 1990s, Evangelicals and Politics in Antebellum America. Really looking at the intersection, the interplay of religion and politics. So I then thought, well, I'll start working on a book on religion and politics in the Civil War. But before I got into that, in 2004, I was derailed. My life, that book was derailed by winning the Lincoln Prize. And it was quite a pleasant derailment, but it was an unexpected one. So for the next few years, with Lincoln's bicentenary coming up in 2009, with the sesquicentenary of the Civil War coming up in 2011, my life was taken over by Lincoln, by essays on Lincoln, by talks on Lincoln. I set up a conference in Oxford in 2009 to mark under the auspices of the Bicentennial Commission in Washington, on Lincoln as a global figure. It was a lovely international conference, and we looked at the ways in which Lincoln was taken up and honored, and it became an inspiration for so many different groups around the world. At that point, I thought I can now get back to my work on religion and politics in the Civil War, when the call came from my old college, my undergraduate college, Corpus Christi College,
Not in Corpus Christi, Texas.
Not in Corpus Christi, Texas. Although there were some, I think I told you, Talmage, there were some American friends who said, "Well, Richard, it's great that you're coming to Corpus Christi, Texas, but why are you leaving Oxford?" Well, of course, I wasn't. I was going to a college that had been founded in 1517, and which, during the course of my presidency, would enjoy its quincentenary. So inevitably, my life was taken over.
We Americans have no idea what that word means, but it means it's been around for 500 years.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for translation, Talmage. That's right. I didn't get back to Righteous Strife and Lincoln until 2018. But that's the story of how I became a Lincolnian. It was I was invited by an English publisher in the 1990s to write a short political study of Lincoln. It seemed a very good idea to do it because there weren't, at that time, you'd be surprised to hear this, there weren't that many books on Lincoln that I could recommend to my students. There was Richard Carwardine, The Lincoln Nobody Knows, the wonderful biography, of course, by Benjamin Thomas, which remains, in my view, one of the great biographies of Lincoln, cradle to grave biographies. But that's how it happened. It was an invitation from an English publisher. I never expected it to win the Lincoln Prize. Having won the Lincoln Prize, I then thought, well, I'll carry on with Lincoln, of course. And then the other book I wrote during the time I was president of Corpus was Lincoln's Sense of Humor, because it's a nice short book which I could do alongside my work preparing for the 500th anniversary of the college. I think that's probably enough.
All right, so let's talk about your book's title and subtitle. Righteous Strife, How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. So let's break it down. Religious nationalists, that's a term I was not familiar with. What does it mean?
Well, I use the term to mean something very simple, which is the fusion of religious vision and nationalist vision. Inevitably, during a civil war, which is about the future of the country, these issues are foremost. The question of what kind of nation should emerge from the Civil War was central to Americans' preoccupation, to the preoccupations, at least of those in the Union. But that question they answered through a lens of religion. This was a highly religious society. Primarily, it has to be said, Protestant, and within that, evangelical Protestant. And there's an enormous amount of very good work written on the religious dimensions of the Civil War, armies and religion, the family and religion, the death in the Civil War. Somehow, the story of politics in the Civil War has remained thoroughly secular, almost thoroughly secular. The politics are treated as if they were in a distinct world. But my intention was to show how the divisions between Northerners over the future of the Union, those divisions were shaped by a religious approach, a religious lens, by the religious belief that the majority of those in the Union subscribed to, and which shaped their understanding of the world. It seemed to me implausible that the politics of the Civil War would be in a remote region separate from religion. So that's what I mean by religious nationalism.
And one of Lincoln's greatest heroes was Thomas Jefferson. And Lincoln liked to talk about the Declaration of Independence more than he liked to talk about the Constitution. And Jefferson, particularly while president, became the grand champion of the separation of church and state. And yet, as your book points out, and per the answer you just gave, during the Civil War, it seemed like with each passing month, with Lincoln at the helm, there was less and less separation and more integration, such that you say that during his presidency, quote, he turned his political office into an adjunct of faith, and he, quote, moved our political nation into unprecedented alignment with religious faith. So what was going on in the country that all these decades of hearing about separation of church and state essentially washed away under his leadership? and all of a sudden they were integrated.
Well, partly, of course, this was happening naturally through the intersection of the pulpit and the political platform. There was a inevitability about the northern pulpit addressing political issues in wartime, and likewise of the um, newspaper editors and the politicians on the platform also invoking religion. But Lincoln harnessed that and encouraged that by declaring a number of days of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. Three of those, one in the summer of 1861, after the horrors of the setback at First Bull Run. Another in the spring of 1863, before the summer campaigns, and another in the late summer of 1864, when so many lives, thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives were affected through the campaign in Virginia, Spotsylvania, the wilderness, Cold Harbor. In addition to the three fast days, he, and it had to be said, the Secretary of State, William Seward, because these proclamations came out over both their names, also authorized and proclaimed days of Thanksgiving, days when, as Lincoln put it in these proclamations, the nation would remember their place under God, when people would remember that and would indeed be encouraged to think about the nation as an entity with a soul, an entity with a conscience, an entity that would be judged by the Almighty. And just as insofar as individuals can be judged after their death, nations cannot be judged after their death. They have to be judged during their lifetime. And the question was, how far was the war to be seen as God's punishment for national sins? So all Americans were being encouraged through these proclamations, these fast day proclamations and Thanksgiving Day proclamations, to think about the nature of their country under God. As you say, Talmage, this is novel. Jefferson has set his face against fast days. Um, Washington had called one. Madison called one during the War of 1812, but mostly they were a source of political contention. And indeed, Andrew Jackson, when he was asked to call a fast day in 1832 during the COVID crisis, the epidemic of COVID, he refused on these very grounds, that this was priestcraft, that to unite the people under the proclamation of a fast day would be to trespass on the terrain of the church. So Lincoln was doing something that was not absolutely new, but was certainly new in the terms of the extent to which he called people to think about their religious obligations and called people to think about how far their own lives and their own preoccupations and their own way of conducting the war were consistent with what God wanted.
Right. So, as we talk about, and a central theme of your book is the growth of Lincoln's faith during his presidency, culminating in his Sermon on the Mount, his second inaugural address. And people who haven't studied this before say, what exactly was his faith? I mean, on the one hand, he never said, I believe in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. He never joined a church. He had memorized large chunks of the Bible. He did lots of Bible study. He did lots of praying. He talked to lots of ministers of all denominations during his presidency. But how would you describe his faith?
His faith shifts dramatically after his election in 1860. Up to that point, I think we can say that Lincoln, as you say, Talmage, he was not an avowed Christian. He was a member of the Presbyterian Church we attended the Presbyterian Church in Springfield, the first Presbyterian Church, old school church in Springfield. But he was not a declared Christian. He was an attender, a hearer, not a fully fledged member, unlike his wife, Mary, who was. Before he got to Springfield, he was known for having dallied with deism, with the religion of Tom Paine, a religion which sees doesn't dispense with the idea of a maker. This maker of the world is a remote figure. Having created the world, God steps back and let it run according to the laws of nature and the laws of reason. Lincoln, through the 1850s, delivers these thoroughly ethical, moral speeches against slavery and against slavery's expansion, explicitly about the expansion of slavery and the concern that the South, the slave power, was now making aggressive moves to spread slavery across the country. But in these speeches, he's reliant largely on Enlightenment thought, on natural law, on the natural rights of the individual. He uses the Declaration of Independence in a really dramatic way to assert that the rights to equality, that God making all men equal, that this extends to black as well as white, which was for Southerners and for some Northerners a kind of shocking reading of the Declaration of Independence. But come his election, Lincoln and the crisis of 1860-61, with the secession of the southern states after South Carolina, Lincoln appears to go through what Noah Brooks, who was a Christian, a Trinitarian Christian, what Noah Brooks thought was a crystallization of faith. And arguably, this is represented, it seems to me this is a very plausible argument, because in his speech he delivers to Springfield when he leaves in February of 1861, he invokes the Almighty, he invokes providence in a way that he has not done before. There are sort of smatterings of references to providence in his 30 years before 1860, what he has to say, but very few. Now, in 1861, both in Springfield and on his journeying to Washington before his inauguration, in all of those speeches, he invokes God and providence. It's a remarkable change. You might say, well, he's doing it because of his audiences. But I think there's more to it than that, because when you start looking at the evidence of his conversations with Orville Browning in 1861, September of 1861, look at his conversations in the following year with progressive friends who come to visit him, conversations with the Chicago Christians who come to see him in September of 1862, it's quite clear that Lincoln does have a view of providence which is very, very different, and of God, which is very different from the one that he had held hitherto. God is no longer a remote figure. God is a figure who intervenes in human life, in country's life.
Yeah, I mean, you might say maybe at the outset of the war, he was thinking that men were in control of the war's outcome. But with each passing month of his presidency, he became more convinced no, God is in control of the war's outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And if I can, I'll try to call to mind accurately the meditation on the divine will that he wrote. It's in Lincoln's hand. It's there in the Lincoln Papers. It's dated September 1862 with a question mark by Nicolay and Hay, who put together the papers. They think it was around about the time of Antietam. Possibly it was a little earlier than that, maybe July of 1862. And in his own hand, Lincoln makes a remarkable statement. He's working his way through. Lincoln is a Euclidean. He's got very clear sense of logic. And so this document, about 150 words, begins, the will of God prevails. In great crises, both parties claim to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must, be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. It is possible that in the present civil war, God's purpose is different from the purpose of either party. But by his It's quite possible that God's purpose is something different from either party. And yet, the human instrumentalities acting just as they do, the human instrumentalities acting just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. Human instrumentality, God is working through humans. By his mere quiet power, he begins by saying, by his, I am all very Lincolnian statement. I am already almost ready to say that this is probably true. As you see, the caution and this is caution, I think, not equivocation. God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power, acting on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a contest. Yet the contest began, and having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. By his mere quiet power, acting on the minds of the now contestants, God's grace, acting on the minds of the now contestants, is what would give people the opportunity to see what God wanted. And Lincoln, of course, included himself in those human instrumentalities. And his struggle was to find out what God did want. The Chicago Christians told him what God wanted. What God wanted was emancipation. They saw him just days before he issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln said to them, not, I think, flippantly, but he said, well, I understand that God has spoken to the Christians of Chicago, but you might think that on a matter which is so much a matter of presidential authority, he might have spoken to me too, and not go via Chicago. It was a wry remark, but not a flippant one, I think. He understood that all men and women of goodwill, all Christians of goodwill, all religions, were looking to work out what it was that God wanted.
Well, along this religious growth and transformation that's going on, there's also transformation in his mind on what to do about slavery. He starts out wanting to stop the spread of slavery into the Western territories. And then, of course, after a year and a half, he decides, I got to do more than that. I've got to issue this emancipation, change the whole war's purpose, thinking it would turn the tide, which it in fact did. And there are Monday morning quarterbacks who said, doggone it, if he's such a moral guy, why didn't he free the slaves earlier? And then there are other Monday morning quarterbacks who, as he becomes more and more obsessed with the importance of emancipation, says, doggone, if he wasn't so obsessed with emancipation, he could have ended the war sooner. He could have worked out a settlement. So talk about this transformation toward his policy on dealing with slavery that was tied to his religious transformation.
Well, it's certainly true, isn't it, Talmage, that when John Fremont declared, as commander of the West, declared the slaves of rebel masters in Missouri free, there were hallelujahs being uttered by not just abolitionists, not just traditional anti-slaverites, but even beyond that constituency. This seemed the right thing to do. But Lincoln, of course, overturned that proclamation in September, the following month, in September of 1861. And did so, he said, willingly, because he was of the view that it was not for the commander in the field to take what would be a dictatorial action. It was for the commander in chief to take the action. But secondly, that such an action was folly. With four of the border slave states loyal to the Union, the last thing you should do would be to make an assault on slavery, which would in all likelihood, send those border states, certainly Kentucky. As you reminded me this morning, Talmage, he said, I want to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Uh, Kentucky, it commands the Ohio River. It links east and west. It's a very powerful military position for the South to secure if Kentucky seceded. So he did absolutely the right thing in overturning that. And he knew that there were troops in Kentucky who would just throw down their arms if he issued an Emancipation Proclamation. But, of course, by the summer of 1862, July, he comes to the cabinet and he says, I have this draft Emancipation Proclamation. What do you think? It comes, of course, after the huge setback in the Peninsula Campaign, when McClellan has to call off the camp and the boats have to leave and retreat follows. And it's a real huge knock to the Union's optimism, self-esteem, and a great worry about how long this war is going to continue, because now it's clear that it's not just the Southern elite who support the war, but the armies are full of non-slaveholding men who are fighting to the death for their independence. So something new is required. And Lincoln goes to his cabinet in July of 1862 and says, here it is, what do you think? And very wisely, William Seward says, Secretary of State Henry Seward says, yes, but not now. If you issue it now, after the shambles of the peninsula, it will look like the last creek on the retreat. Wait for a victory, and then it can be seen as an act of strength. So, of course, Lincoln does wait. He thought that was, and not for the first time, he takes Seward's political advice. And so in September, after Antietam, he presents the document again to his cabinet, and he says, and both Gideon Welles and Salmon Chase note this in their diaries. He says, lowering his voice rather, he had made a promise to his maker. I made a promise to my maker, a vow, that if victory followed at Antietam, the campaign at Antietam, he would issue a document to free the slaves. This was not Lincoln bargaining with God. It was Lincoln trying to establish God's working on the minds of the now contestant. Lincoln trying to establish what it was that God wanted. And for him, the victory at Antietam was a reflection of God's determination that he, Lincoln, should issue a proclamation of emancipation, which of course he then follows up with the final Emancipation Proclamation in July. And after that, Lincoln will not renege. He will not turn back. It's not just a kind of intellectual position. It's always the case with Lincoln that once he'd reached a decision, an intellectual decision, he would hold to it. But this is also an emotional and a spiritual and an ethical position that he would not reverse. There came a point, very briefly, in the terrible summer of 1864, after this enormous losses in Spotsylvania and Wilderness, Cold Harbor, tens of thousands of lives lost. And the presidential campaign, of course, is already effectively underway. Nominations have been made. It's clear that I'm sorry, losing my train of thought here.
A reason of these campaigns.
Oh yeah. Thank you. He's getting messages from around the country from his political managers that he's lost the election. And Lincoln, in fact, does a sort of tally of likely votes, and he sees that the game is up. And so he writes he's prepared to write a letter to Jefferson Davis saying that he's willing to consider negotiations without commitment on part of the Confederacy to emancipation. He began the campaign earlier by stating that he would only enter negotiations if the South was committed to abolish slavery. Now he's prepared to reverse that position because of how bad things are on the battlefield. But he doesn't act on it. He can't act on it. He says if someone is going to renege on emancipation, it'll have to be someone other than me. I can't do it. And he can't do it because it's a moral and a theological and a godly thing.
Well, one of the points I make in my book is that he refused to break a promise. And he had made a promise to God that he was going to issue it, and a retraction on a promise to God would surely not produce good results. But we now need to get to the second inaugural address. And in your introduction, you say, we could have said as the subtitle for your book, what led to the second inaugural address? I mean, to me, it's a mystery that all decades and decades of Lincoln historians would kind of miss the boat in terms of this expansion of Lincoln's faith and his connection with God and produce this address. 702 words. Of those 702 words, over 500 are one syllable. For all you people who think you're writers, think about short words over long words if you want your words to live on. Lincoln understood that better than anybody, but it took less than 6 minutes to deliver. He invoked God 14 times. He quoted 4 scriptures. He mentioned prayer 3 times. Who listened to it said it sounded more like a sermon than an inaugural address. And Frederick Douglass afterwards said this was a truly sacred effort. As he could give it, it's been a rainy, overcast day, and all of a sudden the sun comes through. And then, of course, a week later, he gets shot on Good Friday and becomes a martyr. So, Richard, put all those facts together. Tolstoy described Lincoln as Christ in miniature and talked about all these factors.
Yeah.
Give us your perspective on where it all culminated with the second inaugural address.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Talmage. Yes, that's what I would say. One of my historian friends said, this reads to me like Edmund Wilson's book on the intellectual framework through which the 1917 revolution took place in Russia. To the Finland station is how the book's called. He said, but it seemed to me that your book is to the second inaugural. And it's and I thought I did think for a while of using that subtitle, but my editor chose against it. But anyway, it would have been a very good subtitle for this reason, that by March of 1865, Confederacy was in disarray. It was clear the war was going to be over shortly. And Lincoln took this opportunity to, as you say, deliver a sermon. I mean, it's unique in the history of inaugurals. I think the only shorter inaugural is George Washington's second, yeah. But it's not the shortness alone which surprises. It is just the whole sermonic nature of an address, which sets out the failings of the American nation, North and South. The war, Lincoln explains, as he sees it, is God's punishment of the nation, the whole nation, North and South, for the sin of slavery. Both North and South are complicit in enslavement of Africans. Both North and South, before and after 1776, have enjoyed the benefits, the white North and South have enjoyed the benefits of slavery. And after 250 years of the lash, it is now time that should be paid for by a civil war of carnage, paid for by the sword, punishment drawn by the sword. It's a remarkable document in that it's without self-righteousness. You might have expected a president in that situation to gloat to point the finger at the South for its unwisdom and its folly and its breaking of the covenant with God. He doesn't. He says, we are all in this together. And there's, of course, a political dimension to this because he's looking ahead to the kind of peace that he wants to see that will bring the South back into the Union without malice and with charity to all. But he bases this argument theologically, and he's doing so not because it's good for show. He's doing so because he profoundly believes it. Shortly after delivering the second inaugural, and I always produce this document to those who say Lincoln's public religion was a political stance. What was he saying privately? Well, in part, I point to the meditation on the divine will, which I read to you. But I also point to a letter that he wrote to Thurlow Weed, the great campaign manager, political fixer, Thurlow Weed, who wrote to Lincoln after the second inaugural, and Lincoln rather misunderstands what Weeders says. He misreads what Weeders says. He thinks that Weeders complimented him on the second inaugural. That's quite what Weed was doing. But Lincoln then writes a reply, and I have the text here, and I will read it. It's very short. And Lincoln says, everyone likes a compliment. Thank you for yours on my little notification speech and on the recent inaugural address. I expect the latter to wear as well as, perhaps better than, anything I have produced, but I believe it is not immediately popular. Men are not flattered by being shown that there has been a difference of opinion and purpose between the Almighty and them. This is the key question, key sentence. To deny it, however, in this case, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. It is a truth which I thought needed to be told, and as whatever of humiliation there is in it falls most directly on myself, I thought others might afford for me to tell it. He knew when he delivered the speech that it was not going to be universally popular or immediately popular. Men are not flattered by being shown that there's a difference between themselves and the Almighty. But to deny it is to deny there is a God governing the world. This is a private letter in which Lincoln is setting out why, privately, personally, he has done what he has done, knowing full well that it will not be, as I say, universally popular.
We have time for a couple of questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, Barbara.
Could discuss your research in the computer era. Can you sit at your house in England and not over to the States?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there was no chat GTP or AI to help me in my. Perhaps that's a good thing. Um, I have spent a good deal of time in the United States researching. I've had a research fellowships at Chapel Hill, Southern Collection, Chapel Hill. I've made many trips to the Lincoln Library in Springfield, Illinois. I've had a number of trips to the Huntington Library in Southern California, sometimes for conferences, but on 2 occasions for research fellowships. So I've spent a lot of time in the United States, but I've also benefited enormously from the fact that the very first digital project of the Library of Congress was the digitizing of the Lincoln Papers. The assumption was by the very shrewd judgment of the Librarian of Congress was that the massive grant for digitization in the humanities would receive no pushback once it was clear that it was for the digitizing of the Lincoln Papers, which were previously only available either in person or through 90 reels of microfilm. I bought the 90 reels of microfilm, and I was mightily relieved when in the 1990s the Lincoln papers were digitized. The other aspect, of course, is that now, thanks to Google Books, to Pathy Trust, to Internet Online, thanks to the many digital copies of American newspapers and sermons and polemical political materials, I'm able to do quite a lot of work at my desk. And perhaps it was providential. I'll invoke providence here, that I didn't restart work on a book that I'd begun in 2004 and had to park for 15 years. It was perhaps providential, A, that the amount of material that was available online had enormously increased, and B, that COVID struck. And the enforced lockdown of COVID, and partial voluntary lockdown, which I insisted meant that I had to stay in my study, even though lockdown was being eased. That meant I was able to get on with the research and writing. And so, yes, it is a hazard. When I set out as a graduate student, I had to choose a subject which was transatlantic in its dimensions, in order that I could do the bulk of the work in the UK. But mercifully, now that situation has changed. Yeah.
Yes, Bruce. Would you stand up, please?
Well, what's the death of his voice swayed his opinion and added to this jury of faith? I guess that's what I'm saying.
Death. You're talking about while he was president, or you're talking about Eddie while he was in Springfield?
Yes. I think it. Talmage and I talked about this yesterday, and I do think that Willie's death was hugely significant. That's what Mary Lincoln herself said when she was, after the war, subsequently interviewed by William Herndon, who of course had no love for Mary, but he got a statement from Mary about Lincoln's faith, and she said he was never, he was never really a Christian. He was never a declared Christian, but he became more religious. He said discernibly more religious after Willie's death, and then even more religious at the time he went to Gettysburg. I think the experience of being at Gettysburg in the midst of, shortly after, it's not that long after, of course, I mean, a few months, but still the battlefield was manifestly a battlefield. And he was deeply moved by that. So, yes, I think this is significant. I think Talmage, perhaps, Talmage, you make perhaps even more emphasis than I might, but I wouldn't want to quarrel with you on this. I think it was important, more important, I think, than the death of Eddie, simply because of the context in which Willie died. It wasn't, he was. Both parents were stricken by Eddie's death, of course, and it's one of the reasons why Lincoln moved to the Presbyterian Church, because they'd been so supported by James Smith, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church. But to lose a loved son, as they did, at a time when Lincoln is now under enormous strain in the early months of 1862, and then increasing strain as the months unfold, I think undoubtedly Mary was right. Undoubtedly, you can believe Mary when she says that Willie's death, was actually influential in bringing Lincoln to an even greater reading of the Bible. I mean, his Bible was well thumbed, particularly the New Testament. So he was this constant Bible reader throughout the war.
One more question. Yes, thank you so much for making the trip over time. I know historians bristle at the notion of what if.
Yes.
How do you think his renewed or strengthened faith would have formed Reconstruction differently?
that's a well, I'm allowed to say anything, aren't I? Because it's a. I mean, I think Lincoln gave us a sort of blueprint for Reconstruction on the 11th of April in his speech that he gave to the crowd that came to. They wanted a triumphalist speech from Lincoln at the White House, and instead he gave them a rather sort of detailed prospectus of what should happen in Louisiana and Louisiana Reconstruction. I don't think we can learn anything about Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction from what he said about Reconstruction during the war, because his ideas about Reconstruction during the war were really about how best to win the war and how to create pockets of strength, of Unionist strength within the Confederacy. After the war, what would have happened, I think, in the light of the speech of the 11th of April, is that he would have wanted, as he said in the second inaugural, he would have wanted not to show malice towards the South. He was, as you say in that wonderful chapter on Lincoln in your book, Talmage, he knew he found it difficult to be angry. And once a person who disagreed with him had come to agree or wanted to hold out the hand of friendship, he was entirely happy to accept the hand. He wanted it said of him that he'd always planted a flower where there had previously been a thistle. So I think,
And he never planted a thorn in a man's breast.
exactly. So I think there would have been the hand of friendship, but there would have been conditions, and the conditions would have been that the black population, educated, the black population, free blacks of the South certainly, and those African Americans who had fought so bravely and with distinction through the war should be given citizenship. He would not have. I doubt very much if he would have wanted to establish citizenship for all freedmen until such time as they'd been exposed to education. He had great sense that education was the means by which civilization advanced. That was without regard to color. That's just a sort of statement of, he'd made that statement before the war. So I think those would have been the elements. How do we extend the kind of friendship to the Confederate South, the white Confederate South? How do we embrace 4 million freed men and women and children into the polity? He'd given up on ideas of colonization. During the war, he had that famous meeting in August of 1862 when he gets a deputation of African Americans into the White House. And I mean, that in itself is significant. It's unusual to have distinguished citizens from the African American community into the White House. But he then says to them, you have suffered one of the worst wrongs against any people through enslavement. But the fact is, this war is all about slavery and about your place here, and it would be better, therefore, for us to be separated. And he's urging them to promote schemes of colonization, voluntary colonization, not forced deportation. And for many blacks, this is an outrage. You know, they and their parents and their parents' have been in America. They're not. They belong. They want to belong. And Frederick Douglass, of course, is outraged at this. But that's 1862. And Lincoln's doubts, if he had doubts about the capacity of Black Americans and indeed former slaves, are allayed when he sees how well they fight for the Union. They've earned their cause. And there's a wonderful letter that he writes to James Conkling in September of 1863 in preparation for the fall elections in Illinois. And Conkling, his friend, wants Lincoln to go to Springfield to address a rally. Of course, Lincoln can't go, doesn't, but he sends a letter to Conklin, which he wants Conklin to read. And he tells Conklin how to read it, because he can't do it himself, but it has to be read very slowly. And he sort of underlines it. And in it, he says to the whites he knows there are going to be whites in that audience who disagree with him over emancipation, and who disagree with him over the enlisting of black soldiers. But he says in that letter, well, once we've got the Union restored, you can then have your way. But of course, that's a joke, because once the Union is restored, emancipation will be a reality. But he says there will also be those who will remember that with their clenched teeth and, I can't quote it from memory, I'm afraid, but with clenched teeth and firm tread, the black soldiers have accounted themselves brilliantly. I mean, it's my language, not his. That it's a very different appreciation of the black people, ordinary black folk, than you would have got from Lincoln earlier in the war. So I think his ideas are transformed and are transforming. And as I said earlier, he's always open to. Perhaps I didn't say earlier, I may have said it earlier this morning, but he's always open to question. He's always questioning. He's always open to new evidence, which will help him to move his position forward. So I think that's my answer. Whether it would have lasted, of course, is another matter, because it would have depended on federal authority.
We're going to close. This is something of a thick book, but I can assure you, when I read a book and I come across what I think are particularly great sentences, I put GS in the margin for great sentence, and my book is littered with GS for Richard's book. He is a dazzling writer. You're going to hear about all this fun, interesting stuff that you probably didn't know before, but it's presented in such an artful way, as are his other books. So I encourage you not just to take the book home, but to actually read it. And if you're an aspiring writer, you're going to become a better writer because you read it. So Richard, thank you for coming. We have extra copies if you didn't get, or if you want to buy additional copies. We have friends from Interbank here. We're getting close to Christmas. For your history-loving friends, this will be a great Christmas present. Richard's going to be over there signing. So Richard, thanks for coming to Dallas. Richard Carwardine's new book is on the cutting edge of today's scholarship on Abraham Lincoln's presidency. It's no wonder that the Lincoln Forum in Gettysburg recently awarded its esteemed Richard Current Prize to Richard for Righteous Strife. Make sure you catch all my podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, the website of the Washington Independent Review of Books, my website, and the venerable Dallas Morning News is now publishing and promoting my podcasts. Until next time, remember the words of my late great friend Bobby Bragan. You can't hit the ball with the bat on your shoulder. This is Talmage Boston. Thanks for listening.